I'm Jerry Crow from the Pacifica Historical Society and host of Footprints of Pacifica, the show where we get together every week to discover and explore the lure and lore of lovely Pacifica, its character and its characters. The focus of today's show is a leading and well-known member of our community, Lana Thompson. Welcome to the show, Lana.
Thank you.
People here in Pacifica know you for the countless hours you devote to the senior services rummage sales. What most do not know about is your fascinating background. Let's start with where you were born.
I was born in North Korea from white Russian parents. White Russians are not a geographical division. They are not born in Belarus, which some people attest to. White Russians basically are just like the blues and the grays in the American Civil War.
I see.
The whites who were against the Reds, who were the Bolsheviki, and the Bolsheviki used to wear red bands around their foreheads and also on their caps, or tie a red band around their arm, and that's how you could tell that he was a Bolshevik. And then, of course, you would wear white if you were part of the Tsarist group or not a Bolshevik. There was no gray color, so that was that. But just like in the blues and the grays, of course, it was brother against brother and father against son. So it's a very, very serious situation. My grandparents were well-to-do, and so it was definitely, as one of my acquaintances said, time to get out of Dodge when it was time to flee Russia if they expected to live. My father's family was already in Manchuria, which was the largest settlement, Russian settlement outside of Russia at the time. It was the terminus of the Trans-Siberian Railroad, and my grandfather was the Comptroller General of the railroad. So my father was born in 1907 in Manchuria. My mother's story was different. Her mother was pregnant at the time it was time to flee. The father had just been pulled out of the bed and shot in the garden, as her brothers were also, and so grandmother took off on a train across Russia. By the time my mother was 2 years old, they had reached Manchuria and, of course, Harbin, and they walked. There was no more train, there was no more anything. Harbin was a beautiful, beautiful city. I got the pleasure of going there. Unfortunately, I was too young to know any better. I was taken up there to be christened. And then my father used to go buy things for us in Harbin. This was just before the Second World War. Once the Second World War began, nothing was allowed. We were not allowed across any borders because we were stateless, people without a country. And so therefore, the Japanese could not blame any country for our misdeeds. And why the Japanese? Because the Japanese had control of Korea for 40 years, from 1905 to 1945. So we lived under Japanese rule during that time. My parents finished their gymnasiums in Harbin. The high point of that, as far as I was concerned, was that they both had to have 6,000 Chinese characters memorized before they could graduate from the gymnasium. I only had to take driver's ed here to graduate from Lowell. So it was an interesting difference. My parents knew each other for some time, and when they married, they came to North Korea. North Korea was a country incredibly rich in all natural things, natural minerals, tungsten, for instance. When people say, why did Stalin decide to take half of Korea? He was a wily old fox and he knew exactly what he was doing. He was taking the rich part of Korea and giving the rest of the world the poor part of Korea at the time, because North Korea had gold, it had tungsten, which was necessary for bombs. You could not build an atom bomb without tungsten, and other things. We had a very pleasant life in North Korea. My father was an architect, and there were lots of Europeans having homes built in North Korea. It was a very salubrious climate for those with tuberculosis, and of course, a salubrious climate for those who wish to pad their pockets with wonderful proceeds from various things. There was quite a sizable European community in North Korea. To escape the winters, we would go down to Seoul, Korea, in South Korea. And while we were in Seoul one year, the Emperor of Japan very graciously wrote my father a letter saying, "Thank you for the donation of your property in North Korea. It is now being used as a rest and recuperation center for the Japanese military." We did have that letter for a long time, but when we escaped from Russia, from Korea, it stayed behind with the rest of everything else, such as our birth certificates and such.
So that was strictly an involuntary gift, I'm sure.
Absolutely. We didn't even get $1 for it. Can you imagine?
No,
Isn't eminent domain, aren't you supposed to get $1 or something for it? But one of the things, the war came along. The Second World War was a very serious problem because Korea was stripped of everything by the Japanese for the war cause, including medicine. And by then, my father was dying of consumption. And he took 2 years to die, and he died on November 11th in 1945, just after the Americans came, too late to save him. But the 2 years prior to that were quite painful because there was no medication. And my father was allowed, rationed, mind you, rationed 1 packet of cigarettes every day. And if you could imagine, for a consumptive person, a pack of cigarettes was not exactly the thing that one should have. But even so, he had a wonderful sense of humor. The cigarettes were a Japanese product, and they were called hato. Hato is a dove, and on the cover of the cigarette pack was a white dove. I think the irony of that was too much. When my father was asked, "How can you smoke these?" he said, "Oh, it's all right. They're sweepings from the bird cage of the white pigeon." So that was it. When we left Korea, we were evacuated from Korea on the second day of the Korean War by the American military. We were fortunate in that we were taken out. My mother was working for American military intelligence at the time. She spoke fluent Korean and English and Japanese, so therefore she was translating for the American military government. And the Americans, I guess, decided that it was better to take her out of the country than leave her and shoot her and her family, so that was awfully nice of them. But once we got here, we realized we had nothing. We had not here, well, here also, but so I contacted former friends of ours from Korea and asked them if they had any photographs of my parents, because we did not have any photographs of anything. And they shared this photograph with me, which was taken in approximately 1938 or 39 in Seoul, Korea. The friends who have shared it with me, these are their parents, And my parents are, this is my mother and this is my father. And these were our recollections of the parents. I would like to share with you some other photographs of Korea. And this is the Korea of 1938 and 39, when most people would not even have a recollection of it, because I know most Americans said when they were being sent to Korea, where the is Korea. Well, this is a typical Korean gentleman. This is a typical Korean countryside of the time. You see the thatched roofs, and all the trees are bare, of course, because all twigs are used for heating the Korean ondoru system. It is the subterranean heating that they have in the homes. This is another scene of a typical Korean. The wall, as you can see, is made out of rocks. Sort of reminds you of Ireland. Anyway, here's another one with the rock wall, but it also shows you the cart, the famous cart which was used to haul everything in Korea. It was usually placed behind an ox or a cow, of which there were very few, and the honey bucket, the inevitable honey bucket, used to sit on top over here. This was the Seoul City Hall pre-World War II. And it stands now with lots of holes and is quite different, as you probably see in the newsreels. I would like to share some other photographs of Korea with you, and that is that the Koreans are very, very proud of their ancestors, and there's a great deal of ancestor worship in Korea. So these wonderful tombs are built for the Koreans, not just the kings and the princes, but even people who could afford it used to have tombs. This is one such area where it is a compound. And here's another one. The tile roofs are so incredible. Here is another view of that compound. But this is one of my favorite pictures. It is the gallery of guardians leading to the tombs. These are the guardians, so that everyone has. If you're born in the year of the dog, you have a dog guardian. If you're born in the year of the cow, you have a cow guardian. I always like this one, which is the foo dog, since I was born in the year of the dog. So that was it. That's about it for Korea, I think. We, of course, moved on from Korea to Japan. And in Japan, we stayed 2.5 years. It was a wonderful time to be in Japan. It was 1950 and on, and we made discoveries of such places as Frank Lloyd Wright's wonderful hotel in Tokyo, which withstood the Second World War, if you can imagine. And so all of it was a very, very nice time. The biggest shock was coming to the United States. We immigrated to the United States so that my mother could teach at the Monterey Army Language School. And we, since we were stateless, we had an offer of employment. I keep saying we, it is my mother, in France, in Australia, in Japan itself, and also in the United States. Mother selected the United States, and we boarded an empty cargo ship at the end of January and sailed the Pacific, which it isn't in January or February. We rolled from one side of the ship to the other. I, to this day, have trouble getting on board a boat because it is so traumatic, so incredibly traumatic to be on that. But we managed. We arrived in the United States, and our birth here was taken in San Francisco, so we landed in Alameda. And the tide was going out when we were debarking, and I wish I could find every one of those people who told me how smelly my country was. What a stinking country you live in, meaning Korea, and all of the honey buckets and the honey pots, because Alameda, with the tide out, was no better than any part of Korea. But we settled in San Francisco because my godmother found us an apartment here. And we were precursors to the hippies because we were on Masonic and Waller, which was right there in the Haight-Ashbury. It was really wonderful. And I went to Lowell High School, just down the street, and graduated that February from Lowell High School. It was quite a shock. I graduated, there were 375 students graduating then. I had come from my class of 4 students. It was the Convent of the Sacred Heart in Tokyo, which was held in the Imperial Palace. So from the Imperial Palace and 4 graduates, I was thrown into Lowell on Hayes Street with 376 graduates. It was a very exciting time, but very, very, very debilitating for us. The acculturation was difficult, very difficult.
Were you familiar with English when you first arrived?
Yes, yes. I'm very fortunate in that I had started studying English in Korea and Spanish. And so, of course, we had quite a nice European colony in Seoul, and everybody was a foreigner. You know, they were from Switzerland or even, I think the Remington people, the Remington typewriter people, representatives were from England or someplace. You know, it wasn't that they were Americans. The Singer sewing machine people were from America. But so we had the Seoul Foreign School, foreign being just that. And it really was an eye-opening experience to come here and discover what a unique system there was in this country. Only thing is, I was thrown into civics, U.S. History 1, U.S. History 2, and social goals in my high senior year, all at one time. It was very traumatic, but it was great fun, for when I went for my citizenship papers, I argued with the judge about some of the finer points he was asking me about. So that was kind of interesting.
Oh, good for you.
After living in San Francisco, I met my husband, a very wonderful Scotsman with blue eyes. How can you resist a Scotsman with blue eyes? And we lived in Park Merced, where all newly marrieds lived. And then we moved to Santa Clara and Fremont, where we had our children. And eventually it was time for me to leave Mr. Thompson. And I moved back into San Francisco and immediately went to work for San Francisco State University. I was not hired to be a secretary or an instructor or anything. I was hired to be S.I. Hayakawa's Japanese translator, because Professor Hayakawa was becoming president of the university and he spoke no Japanese.
A little known fact for sure.
Yes. And of course, all of the Japanese wanted to come and visit him, visit this great man who was settling the strike and was doing all these wonderful things for the students. And so they would come to the office and they would try to present things to him and make proper murmuring sounds. And he would look at me like, what are they saying? What are they saying? You know, and so I had to make proper murmuring sounds back. And then finally, and is always the case, the Japanese would like to dismiss me because they want to talk to him about really interesting things. Only thing is that many of them did not speak English, so it was always quite a battle. Mr. Hayakawa lasted very nicely at San Francisco State, but he finally stepped down to run for the Senate, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And he was elected. And as many of us know, he slept through most of the sessions very nicely, but he was a wonderful representative from the areas. And so that was the phase of S.I. Hayakawa. I
remember you saying something about your involvement in the Russian community. I wonder if you could tell us a little about that.
I would be happy to. San Francisco has a very large Russian community. At one time, there were 50,000 Russians here in San Francisco alone. And that was before the immigrants from the Soviet Union began to come over here. We have, actually, a Russian newspaper once a week, a weekly Russian newspaper. I will talk about that a little later also. It is called Russkaya Жизнь, which means Russian life. Isn't that clever? And this is during the visit of the Patriarch of Russia. When the Patriarch of Russia came to San Francisco, I was his hostess here. And since I had been very active in Fort Ross, it was only natural. These are wonderful historical photographs of Fort Ross. See the sheep still grazing there? This is how Fort Ross used to look. This is how Fort Ross looked when the Patriarch was there. He was shooting off the cannon, surrounded by clergy, and this was his welcome. I was translating for him the park. The head Smokey the Bear was giving welcoming things, and so those needed to be translated. This is a photograph of my mother with the Patriarch and me, because my mother ran the food for everybody. And of course, you know, you don't travel this far without food. And here are the ladies setting up the tables for food. And that was Fort Ross. I wanted to show you this picture because this is Holy Trinity Cathedral in San Francisco. And this is the congregation, and the Patriarch came to visit us here in San Francisco because Holy Trinity Cathedral was built by the Tsar of Russia. As a matter of fact, one of the bells in the tower is a melted down locomotive of the train that almost killed the previous Tsar. And so he melted it down and sent it to the new country to establish this wonderful place.
An unusual gesture.
Yes, yes. One that was stolen. The bell was stolen at one time when we were refurbishing the place. And our priest went on television and said, if you find a bell out there that has Russian markings, return it, because otherwise you will be eternally damned. And so it was returned. It was wonderful. So no questions asked. It was just deposited by the front door, and we never knew anything. So I'm also very, very active in the Russian community as far as the Russian Children's Welfare Society is concerned. It is an 82-year-old organization which was created to help children of Russian descent, no matter where they were in the world. And of course, that's how they ran. We now raise funds for these children in orphanages and buy prostheses for them and everything. We do a fundraiser once a year. And here I am giving a thank you for a check that is being handed to me. I always thank people when they're handing me checks. And these...
We're going to have to shorten up a little here.
Okay, all right.
So,
and these are photographs of children who are performing.
Let me show just this one then.
Okay. Many of the Pacificans know how I go to their garage sales and try to buy children's clothing, especially rubber booties for the kids.
That's very nice.
We are now going to... I came to Pacifica, 40-something years ago, I don't even remember, due to busing in San Francisco. My children suffered greatly at busing. And so I just I came and raised my children here, and how shall I put this? Where would you like to go with this? These are my grandchildren.
Oh, I see. Yes.
Who are now adults, but that is my favorite photograph of my grandchildren. Stuffing their faces with chocolate old fashions. They follow in me. And I will share these with you later, but right now I want to show you, do we have time to talk about volunteering in Pacifica?
Maybe half a minute, I think.
All right. For those who know, we have rummage sales at the community center each Wednesday. A year ago, we raised $29,000. This year, we are raising $34,800 so far. And I just want to tell you that we need your donations, as always, because the community center only exists through your donations. This is the type of item that you are going to see there. And for closing, we are going to have this Wednesday a sale on World War II books. And I think this is the ultimate World War II book. It is in Japanese, and it is about World War II.
Well, that's very unusual, for certain. This being the front cover in the way that the Japanese arrange their books.
That's right.
Well, that's about all we have time for today. We want to thank Lana for joining us and sharing the stories from her remarkable life. If you'd like to get involved with the Pacifica Historical Society and our many projects, our address is Post Office Box 752, Pacifica 94044. You can also find us on our website, pacificahistory.org, or call for information on telephone number 650-359-5462. Thank you for watching our show, and we'll leave you with a quote from Longfellow. Lives of great men all remind us we can make our lives sublime, and departing leave behind us footprints in the sands of time.
That's so lovely.